Magic is found in every room, where people connect over a shared purpose. Luke, Hannah and Chris explore the role of purpose, courage, mindset and culture in every leader's quest for transformational performance.
Hello and welcome to Magic in the Room. I'm Hannah Broderud.
And I'm Chris Province.
And I'm Luke Freeman. And we are here together today in Durant, Oklahoma, at the National Native American Human Resources Association's annual conference. Super excited to see you guys. Hannah had to fly in all the way from Montana, go through the super fun experience of DFW. It's at the bottom of my list of airports. I hate to say. Apologies, any Texans listening. But we are today talking about recognition. We're going to talk about rewards a little bit, what's different between rewards and recognition, and we're going to talk about how do we change people's motivation with recognition. This really builds on what we've been talking about all season, which is how we lead a team. Now, oftentimes we learn all these skills about our own performance, our own productivity, growing up in our first jobs where we're not leading people. It's all about what can I get done? Can I be responsible? Can I be effective? Can I have high quality work output? And then all of a sudden we are thrust into leadership and it's a whole different skill set. So this season we're talking about that different skill set. We've had episodes around how do we build trust? How do we provide accountability to people? How do we communicate effectively to team members? How do we navigate conflict? All sorts of other things. There are guides for those at magicintheroom.com. And there's a guide for today's episode around recognition at magicintheroom.com. You can always go download those guides, check it out. Really excited for the conversation today. So, Chris, jump in. What is recognition?
I don't know. I'd like to break down the language first. Okay. We can say, recognition, recognition, re again, and then cognition, or cognoscere being the Latin root word, to know. So literally means to know again. Also translated to identify. So immediately I'm to identify what? To know what? And I think one of the fundamentals of underperformance that we see in organizations is the not knowing. To not knowing the first time, let alone to know again. So to execute recognition or recognition, we must know initially that purpose, those guiding principles, our service standards, what we're committed to. Because ultimately, when we know those things, we can identify and recognize the characters and the people that elevate our existence as an organization. It's the behaviors that help us attract customers, players, or guests that believe what we believe. It's the behaviors that keep our teams forged and moving forward. So as I think about recognition and what it is, I just like to start with, hey, let's name the language of it first and kind of call back to the fact, to know again, we have to know initially. And that's why when we talk about performance work, it always starts with the purpose, and the commitments, and guiding principles, and how intensely do we believe? Because that intensity of the belief also translates to the type of programs that we use for recognition, right?
I love that, to know again and to identify, because it also calls to mind for me when you talk about what are we going to know again, and meaning what should we know in the first place, it's also the person, right? To know who they are and how they're uniquely contributing and in what way they express that purpose and those values. That means we have to pay attention.
Yeah. Well, when we pay attention, and I think the process of recognition, as we define it as a people practice, it's really a social signaling. It can be confirmatory, right? We'll take Ben over here. Ben did this for someone on the team. We want to identify that Ben is that type of person. He's a person that makes our team better. It's confirming the character of Ben. And when people do the things like Ben does, we are a stronger team. And it's this idea that the easiest way to get more of a behavior is to recognize that behavior is valuable within our organization or your family or your community or whatever you're a part of. But when we recognize a behavior has value, that's how we get more of it. And calling back to the last episode, it's why when we see behaviors that are not helpful or dilute our brand or dilute our community and put us at a discount, we have to excavate those behaviors from the system as well. So it's really, I love the offense and defense of it. I think it calls to being a warrior for your organization, for your family, for your community, to say, this is how we extract or eliminate discounting our negative behaviors from our organization or community. This is how we recognize things that are value added, the things that make us better, the things that really align with the vision of this organization. This is how we celebrate those. But to be timid about either of those things is a real challenge. And I'm interested in, Luke, what is your perspective on why are organizations sometimes timid about corrective action or recognition, kind of playing that offense and defense or really being warriors for the brand?
Well, I think it's because we don't embrace that organizational leadership, team leadership is around creating outcomes that we want and changing people's behavior. And sometimes we feel weird about that. We feel like, well, why don't you just let them be them and everyone fits on our team? And as long as someone doesn't do something against, that's unethical or that's illegal, who am I to tell them what to do? And while that hesitation is good, right? When people lose that hesitation and they get really comfortable telling people what they need to do and how they need to show up, clearly that's a problem. And I also think it's a problem when we don't admit and embrace that part of our job as leaders is shaping how people behave and what they spend their time doing. And I'll just go with these kind of two sides of the coin and kind of the yin and the yang around recognition and corrective action. Like, if we don't master both sides, it's very difficult to get the outcomes that we want. We accept unintentional behavior rather than saying our goal is that our team exhibits intentional behavior that moves us toward our shared purpose. Yeah.
With the caveat that development is really a focus, right? Which is, if we do our jobs well, focusing on development, ideally, we don't have to spend a lot of time on corrective action. And I think we've talked about that in the previous episode. Whereas recognition, we can always do more recognition.
Sure. I mean, that's what goes back to, the Hershey's study and like you can actually calculate how many transactions you need within an organization that are recognizing behavior in order to set a culture. And that's really, to state that the performance of the people on our team, we take a longitudinal, long game, infinite game, I would say, approach to, where you're going to have moments of recognition and moments of correction. But it's all in the name of development of the people and development of our work communities and of the brands that we're establishing and positioning within the marketplace.
Well, and I'll say that really hits to the other underlying assumption that makes people not spend time on recognition or on corrective action, which is, I'm going to use a car metaphor. Once I'm up to speed and at cruise control and headed towards my destination, like, I'm good. I don't have to do other stuff. But that's not true. The car's using fuel. The car is being steered constantly to keep it between the lines. I am paying attention on when I hit a speed zone and I need to slow down and then speed up again. And I'm looking at the cars around me. And Onboarding someone and getting them up to speed, quote unquote, in their role, sometimes we are tempted to think that is what is required, and then that person's on cruise control consistently. Or, hey, I've built the right team and I have all my roles filled, so we are good. And all we have to do now is operate day in and day out. But that's not the reality of the universe in which we live. The reality is that all things break down without management. All things disintegrate over time, drift off course without consistent action and intentionality. And until we accept that that's the case, I think we are unclear on our role as leaders in that we do provide the maintenance. We do provide the lines on the sides of the road to keep us moving forward. We do provide the amount of gas that we're given. We decide when it's time to pull over and refuel. Like, we decide all of those pieces.
Yeah. Recognizing that entropy is a factor in every system, whether it's a individual human being or a system of humans, which organizations are. The other thing that came to mind as you were talking, Luke, is, you can be efficient or you can be effective. And being effective isn't always efficient. And you can be very efficient without being effective. And everything when it comes to developing human beings, it takes time. It's usually not efficient. It takes some investment. And having that basic mindset, I think, helps, because if we try to make these processes efficient, they often become very transactional and not as effective as they could be.
Yeah, and I want to talk about that difference between like transactional recognition and meaningful recognition here in just a moment. But to kind of bring home this idea of entropy, things left in isolation trend downward in performance, right? It's like, why do you paint the barn? Well, I want to call out in this episode, though, the same rule applies to not understanding the long-term impact of avoiding an action today. Something that seems inefficient today, but contributes to ultimately us getting to that destination. So it may feel inefficient today when we're rolling along here and we have to pull over and have a conversation about where we're going next. But it's exactly that conversation that if I'm navigating someone's performance across their career and I'm a good steward of the folks that I hire and the communities and families I'm trying to impact, if I take time to have that stewardship conversation, it affects ultimately how we get to where we go long term. So that coaching conversation that we don't want to stop and take time to do today, if I don't do that today, there's little cost. But if I don't do that for a month, there's significant cost. And if I never do that, there's not a chance we're going to get to where we need to go. So that's, I think, a great analogy. And to me, like recognition, that's the turbocharger, and then our corrective action, like the car's got to go in the shop for a minute. We got to change the timing belt. We got to, do a tune-up, right? But when we think about it more in those terms, it certainly feels less severe. And just say there's this system where we're stewarding someone's long-term development as we work as a team to contribute to the success of this organization. As that steward, I have a responsibility to not allow entropy to exist, to have the conversations, do the tune-ups, turbocharge the progress, and know where the folks on our team are at. So helpful conversation about what it is. And Hannah, you touched on this idea of like sometimes recognition can feel transactional, sometimes it can feel very personal and transformational. How do you process all that? What is meaningful recognition and what are the other types of recognition? How do you break all of that down?
Yeah, and that's the big question, right? What makes recognition meaningful? That's the big question on the minds of many leaders and organizations. How do we do this well in a way that's actually meaningful? And to some extent, it's subjective, because what's meaningful to one person may not be as meaningful to another. Very much like we have different love languages, we have different languages of appreciation, right? For some people, that means words. For some people, that means an action. For some people, that means spending time with them. For some, that means a gift, a tangible symbol. But I think when it really comes down to it, what's most meaningful is when we recognize character. So I like to think of it in terms of, there's 3 ways you can give a compliment just to demonstrate that, right? I can compliment someone on something they have, like their looks or their shirt or, something external. I can compliment someone on something they do, right? Some observed action, behavior. And the third level, which is really the deepest and most meaningful, I can recognize the character of that person that led to that behavior. And when we do that well, and that goes back to we really do have to pay attention and get to know people on a certain level to know their character and to be able to call that out. And when we do, that's when people feel like, man, yeah, you really got me, right? And that feels really meaningful. And it also means we recognize, we know people well enough to know what mode or what language of appreciation really speaks to that individual.
And you mind if I try that in real time right now? Sure. Okay, so if I understand this correctly, one way I could do this is say, Hannah, thanks for being here and recording the podcast with us today. And okay. I could also say, Hannah, I really appreciate you being here today. I know we had very limited days where we could record. This required you to get up at 2:30 in the morning, leave your house in Big Sky where it's 28 degrees, fly here, to the Dallas area to then come to a conference, which we have a load of commitments this week around. But to come here, not check in, come straight to our studio and start recording, because this is a process that we committed to, and just how you honor this podcast and Luke and I as co-host when you show up, and just the commitment it required for you to be here today. I understand that that's a lot. And I just really appreciate being able to be a co-host with you because of how committed you are and the character that you bring to us in this show.
Thank you. That means a lot.
Or, thanks for being here.
Yeah, nice shirt.
So, and that's, I think, a good kind of lead into recognition doesn't have to cost anything.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Now, sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't. Can you break it down as far as, what is recognition and what is a reward?
Yeah. So, not for recognition to be meaningful, it doesn't necessarily have to be tied to a reward. It doesn't have to mean some kind of financial incentive, right? So what we just demonstrated, when we recognize character and we really see and hear and value someone for who they are and the way that they contribute in a unique way, that's really meaningful, and it doesn't have to cost anything. Now, sometimes we give rewards, and rewards are often tied to incentives. They're often, they're usually an expectation when there's an award, right? It's something that we know that we can predict, but where not all recognition has to have a reward. Every reward, for it to be meaningful, should come with some form of recognition. It is a form of recognition, but if we just strip the reward part and it just becomes about the trophy and we miss the meaningful part, then it really is transactional, right? Whereas recognition, when done well, is relational.
And I see it I have a number of examples in my background where an organization has attempted to recognize with a reward, but there's no understanding that the reward was intended to be a recognition. Or it can come off there, like on the reward front, sometimes it can come off as incredibly insincere. If I trade 16 sweet tickets at the Niners game for 50 middle bowl tickets and say, hey, everybody, here's 50 tickets to the game on Sunday. For what? Or, hey, we had a record year, but we're going to recognize our employees by giving them their favorite soda and candy bar. And that's how we're recognizing beating last year by $40 million. Like, that's real scenarios, right? Where the team members are not, like, they get it. They know what you're doing. So really making sure that when it is a reward and you intend it to be a recognition, make certain that is tied to meaning. And if it is a reward that is not intended to be meaningful, please treat it as such and expect that outcome. Luke, your thoughts on that?
If we don't understand why people went above and beyond or what it is that would be meaningful to them, we can get ourselves in trouble real quick. Because it's kind of like, have you ever helped someone move and then they're like, oh, well, take $20 for your gas today or whatever. And you're like, no, I thought I was helping you move because I am your friend and I wanted to give my time to you today. Right? It's not helpful to the relationship to then monetize it or turn it into compensation when all that would really reinforce that behavior of me coming and helping them move would be like, oh my gosh, thank you so much. This has been awesome. Like, let's get together next weekend and hang out and enjoy my new place, or whatever. So,
yeah, and that's a whole nother can of worms. But yeah, when we do use financial incentives, if we do monetize the reward, it also still better be meaningful and an actually meaningful financial incentive. And especially if we tie compensation to performance, but we give some really, really insignificant dollar amount, it can have the exact opposite effect, right? It feels like an insult rather than actually meaningfully recognizing the behavior.
Yeah, people might not think this consciously, but the internal conversation is, I thought I was doing this because we're all in this together and we were trying to accomplish something, but you, boss, were actually valuing monetarily all of that time and all that work that we were doing. And to you, this is a financial, you've got a profit and loss associated with this project in your mind. And okay, I see where I stand. I'm part of you winning.
And if that's all it's worth to you, now I feel devalued.
And you could afford to give me the Starbucks gift card out of your net profit so that I'll do it again. I mean, that's what we want to avoid.
Well, and 100%. And so tie it back to why your organization exists, your greatest possible good. And let's think, from an application standpoint, when is someone new to your organization provided their initial recognition? Okay. So, and it's why, there's I'm going to pull some thread here. It's why artifacts are important. It's why words and language that we use inside our organizations are important. It's like why culture is built on language. Something like, by admitting me purpose and performance group, by admitting me into its ranks, has conferred upon me a mark of distinction. And I take pride in that distinction because I believe in the spirit of leadership. And I agree to never discharge the obligation to others because I am a steward and I am a leader. Now, as soon as I understand that, and I understand that's what this organization is about, we can build really good programs around that. We can build recognition around that. But what do I get when I understand that? When I get the language, when I say, yes, I am about that, I want that mark of distinction. Is that a certificate? Is it a pen? Is it a reward? Is it a clap it up and everybody have some cake and punch? What am I doing to bring home that idea, to recall, to know again what I just committed to? And that's the whole idea, is in recognition you will find a lot of artifacts, because the purpose of the artifacts is to recall and to celebrate. But we have to be tied to that thing. I'm just, while we're here, and we'll put some links in the show notes, let's go ahead and call out honors versus money, because it calls out kind of all the artifacts and what is confirmatory and what is aspirational, and it talks about different types of programming. So if you want to really dive deep into all the different applications of recognition, I strongly recommend that book. But I mean, picking the right artifact or the right celebration for the right moment and the right value, I think, and the right environment, I think, is mission critical. Where do you see that applying?
I think it's an art as much as anything. And the cost is you being aware and intentional. So I think most recognition given, most awards given, if they are intentional and well thought through and come from a place of really understanding the contribution that the person has made, right, there's a lot of winning to be done. I mean, I don't want people to listen to this and come away afraid that they're going to mess up recognizing folks on their team. Like, it's not maybe as difficult as we're making it sound.
We're going deeper on it.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, this really can be, hey, everybody, great job today. Like, let's go get a drink. It's on me. Right. That's awesome. It can be, hey, everybody, I made cookies. Like, I know we've had a hard week. Like, let's enjoy it together. It can be, hey, everyone, before we start the meeting, I just want to shout out Chris. If you didn't see the other day, we were together in a workshop and he really showed up and people had some light bulbs come on who were participants, and like, thank you for showing up in that way. It was awesome. It was better because you were there. Any takeaways from that you could share with us on like how you got that insight to say the right thing at the right time, right? Like, that's recognizing character, but it's not complicated. It's really just like me being aware as a leader. Where are we at? How are people feeling? What good things have happened? How do I call them out? How do I make sure everyone gets the accolades that they should get for how they contribute to this team? And I know we've got one leader who's a client of ours who they make time every week at the end of the week, and they set aside 10, 15 minutes. It's on their calendar. And on Friday afternoon, they look back and they say, what happened on my team this week that needs to get a shout out? And they'll either write an email right then, or they'll put it on their notes for next week's agenda with the team, or say, hey, someone go order this thing for this person. But it's just intentional. It's not huge. It's not a program. It's just, I don't let a week go by without thinking about who on my team should be recognized for something that happened this week.
I want to touch on that recognition you just gave me. Thank you, by the way. That's like every workshop we're in, though. I wanted to speak to, like, you connected it to the purpose of our organization. It's based on real work that I did. Okay, so it's connected to why we exist as a company. It's based on real work that we did. You're honoring something I showed up in character to do, or with character to do. It's specific to that workshop we were in Wednesday or whenever that was. It's timely because 2 weeks haven't passed. 1 month hasn't passed. It's right now. It's delivered in a way that I prefer, words of affirmation, right? I like when people notice that I maybe allowed my character to show through in a courageous way. Then I will be more likely to do it again. And it's ongoing, especially when he asked that question of, hey, can you share some insight to like what were the cues that you used to bring up that specific function at that specific time, right? So we can all be better and we can continue kind of that culture going forward. So it kind of hit all those marks, those characteristics of meaningful recognition. It's connected to why we exist. It's based on work that I'm doing. It's something about my character, specific, timely, delivered in the way that I prefer, and it speaks to the ongoing nature of our work together. So I think that is, super helpful. But, what does this all mean? What's it mean? Hannah, can you share a little bit about what it means for engagement and retention? I mean, we're always focused on like reducing expenses. And I always look at, man, what if we could reduce our turnover expense by 30%?
Well, I mean, what really lies at the heart of it is motivation, right? We always scratching our heads and trying to figure out how can we motivate people. And to some extent, that's a misnomer because you can't really motivate people. Everyone is motivated for something, and it's their job to figure out what that is. We can inspire people to do their best work, but motivation is intrinsic. And if we really understand what actually motivates people, it might also help us think about this recognition versus reward thing a little differently, right? A reward or an award is something that's expected, that because I did this thing or because our performance was X or because I applied for this award, right? We get awards and it's expected. But the effect of that on motivation doesn't last. When it comes to really meaningful recognition, it's recognizing the intrinsic motivations, and that has a much more lasting effect because it's really about, meaningful recognition. Science will show that it's more effective when it wasn't expected, when it's after the fact, but in a timely fashion. And really, engagement, motivation, they kind of go hand in hand, right? So when people feel intrinsically motivated to do good work because they really care about the work itself, about the organization they work for, the cause or the mission, or the other humans that they work with, that's when we really start to see higher levels of engagement. And there's studies that have shown, the turnover differences in turnover rates when someone gets recognized once a year versus 3 times a year versus 6 times a year, right? You can show directly how engagement reflects in lower turnover rates. The more frequent the recognition, the lower the turnover.
You bet. And really getting to, you're talking about people that get recognized once a year, turning over 15%, people that are recognized 6 times a year, turning over at 4%. Boy, there's a lot of semantics to unpack, but we're going to leave it at face value for now. But the whole idea is that if our recognition systems need to recognize 80% of the employees 6 times a year. So if we just have the employee of the quarter, we're not touching near enough people if that's what we're leaning on. And that's why those, your one-on-one coaching conversations under your performance development program are so critical because you can recognize in there. You can recognize in team meetings if you set up your comms framework effectively. But we've also got to partner with HR from the operations side on building the right tools to make sure that the leaders can execute that. So there's this whole outfitting of the organization. Is our organization outfitted to recognize 80% of the team members 6 times a year?
Yeah. I think a related concept here is, feedback and coaching. And there's also this misnomer that feedback creates higher engagement, but it's really not feedback, it's attention, because every human being wants to feel seen and heard and valued. And that's a really strong intrinsic need versus we have the need to be publicly. I always have people that want to argue with me about that and say, well, I don't need to be recognized. Well, maybe you don't need to be publicly recognized. And in fact, maybe that's not helpful for you because it feels embarrassing or whatever. But on some level, we want to be noticed. So attention is really actually the thing that makes a difference. And studies will show the quickest way for people to disengage is when you ignore them. You ignore people, they will disengage. You give people a lot of critical feedback, and you will see some higher engagement because any attention is still attention, right? But where you see exponential increase in levels of engagement really is when you pay positive attention to what people do well. And we can do that on a daily basis, right? If we notice what someone does well and we let them know that we notice, to your point, Chris, earlier, it's going to make them want to do it more.
Right. And, there's this calling. And Luke, I'm going to ask you about the orientation of it. So to Hannah's point, yes, we have got to train our eyes to notice the contribution. Here's the risk of not having organizational commitment, though. If we looked at a scatter plot of performance, and over here you've got the zeros and over here you have the tens, and one department says, I'm going to do recognition, I'm fully committed. And in their department, 80% of the people are getting recognized 6 times a year. They listen to the episode and they're like, yeah, that's a great idea, right? So on their team, some people that perform as a 3 or as a D player are getting recognized for some specific tasks. Meanwhile, the A players are getting recognized for character and contributions and all kinds of good stuff, right? But then over here on this team, because the organization's not committed, you have 10 level 10 employees, A plus players, not being recognized. And they're going to look over here and saying, well, that person from that department is getting recognized and they're not anyone I'd even want to be on the same team with. So reconcile all that for me.
So who do you think they blame in that scenario? I mean, if you, Chris, are the manager who is leading that department where 80% of the team members are getting recognized 6 times a year, and I'm leading the department that has just as talented people on it, but I don't do any recognition at all. I'm the one with the target. The smart people, the high performers, they know they don't resent you and your team. They might a little bit, but eventually when the hens come home to roost, it's on me, right? They're like, well, Luke sees what I do every day. And when have I ever gotten that? Never. And Luke's boss knows that Chris is doing this and Luke isn't, and he's letting Luke just not do anything. And that's not fair. So it's our CEO's fault.
It's the company's fault.
It's the company's fault. And that's the risk that we run. So I guess this is maybe a cautionary tale a little bit, because on the one hand, if you start recognizing your team members more, I think there's very little risk to you, and the performance is going to continue to go up on your team. You'll do fine. You'll be okay.
Yeah, good for you.
Yeah.
Maybe bad for your neighbor.
Right. The watch out is for other folks that don't see it, aren't intentional. How do we bring them along? How do we bring executive leadership along to say, hey, we've done this. Here's our outcomes, right? And if you need to look at the turnover numbers, it costs 20 to 30% of someone's annual salary to replace them by the time you put together the cost of your time of whoever's working on hiring, logistics, all the interview time, training time required for that new person, certifications they have to get, whatever, right? It adds up to 20 to 30% of their role. It doesn't take much decrease in turnover to pay for your time to be more intentional with recognition. You get it back you get that resource of your time or the small budget dollars you put towards it, you get it back relatively quickly.
You brought up fairness, Luke, and Chris, in your example too. I think it's huge, and we do know that fairness is one of the 4 antecedents to engagement because of how much it affects the team member experience. And what's been really eye-opening for some leaders as we've been having these conversations lately is about how fairness has as much to do with accountability as anything else. Yes, we got to pay people fairly and Fair Labor Act, and we have to have fair and equitable practices. However, that example that you just played out, it's about accountability, and accountability starts with commitment. So it goes back to one of our early episodes in this series when we talked about commitments and accountability. So to your point, Chris, if we're not committed as an organization and it's not clear what we're committed to, and we don't hold people accountable, or we don't create an environment in which there is accountability to those commitments, then things don't feel fair. And when things don't feel fair, people are less likely to be engaged.
Well, and I like that a lot. I'm going to go ahead and bridge that in to say, well, we are accountable as leaders who lead teams. We are accountable to elevate the values and the standing of this organization. And one of the things that we have to do in order to accomplish that and fulfill that accountability and that obligation is recognize people that advance our community. We start scratching at that idea eventually, right, when we get into, leading leaders. How we lead our teams and how we develop future leaders for this organization not only establishes our culture, it's what creates thriving community, the community in which we do work. So we cannot separate accountability, leadership, and vibrant communities. In order to have a vibrant community, we have to have accountable leadership. And it's why underperforming organizations look at these as options. They do not look at them as obligations. And strong recognition programs they're non-negotiable. And once in place is not something you can go cut the budget by 90%. Right? That's why when you build them, think about building as much as possible without cost, but use processes and other ways to make sure people are receiving that. But this whole idea that we're going to really lean into team member of the quarter and we're going to nominate 20 people and give them some lower level of recognition that they ultimately didn't win, we're going to give one person the big star. And at the end of the year, we'll have 4 or 5 big stars given out. And that's all we're leaning on. We've got to run away from that stuff. The nominate and vote and all of that is subjective. When we make our programs really focused on, did this person elevate a value? And do it like that. Like, if it's believed they did, then let's recognize them for it.
Yeah. And I will say ritual matters, and it's also pretty cheap or free. So just how do we make the ritual of recognition part of who we are and what we do? I mean, quick story here. Maybe it was definitely one of the first recognition programs I created. I was 26 probably. I had like 3 or 4 people who reported to me. I mean, not a lot. And I decided I wanted to do a team member of the week thing and give us a chance to shout out each other. And every week we did a team member of the week and we voted among the 5 or 6 of us. And I built a trophy, and it was like huge and hideous. Like I went around and scrounged and I found like a 4x4 somewhere and an old plate somewhere else. And I think it might have had like a lawn ornament flamingo on it. And I screwed it all together and made a little base in my garage and screwed it on there. And then I spray painted the whole thing gold and just Sharpied on it, team member of the week. And every week, whoever got it got to sign it. And maybe we put what they did on there. We just passed it around. Like every week you bring it to the team meeting and we talk about who did something great that week. And like, doesn't cost anything except a little bit of time and intentionality. And
Yeah, and that conversation and reflection has a ton of value. And I think that's, when we dig into kind of this last piece, like simple, practical ways to get started. I mean, that's example A. One of my favorite things to do is like just as part of orientation and bringing someone on, I want to know what all they like. I don't want to have to guess about what they like, what their favorite color is, or what sorts of treats are they coffee or not coffee? Are they chocolate or vanilla? What do they do with their family? Those are all things that we can do during the orientation or onboarding process to get, I call them faves and craves. So then if I'm looking for just to make a transaction inside the process of recognition, I mean, like, I can make really simple, easy things. So that's something procedural that you can do to kind of pave the way to when you know what someone likes, then you have an easier path to recognize or do something kind for them. And in an organization where I'm leading 1,200 people, it's very difficult to have all those conversations and then recall what that might be. So, there are processes that you can use. So that's, the other thing that I would just push out there is like, to give a pen or a certificate for completing new hire orientation, like, awesome. If you want to be like world class, recognize someone for coming to an interview, right? Like, don't be afraid to be an artist and create what works for your organization. And, don't be bashful in your celebration of people. What are some things you can think of to maybe get rolling, Hannah?
Well, I just love that term, celebrating people, because that's really what it comes down to. How do we celebrate people well? And look for opportunities to catch people doing something right. And I know sometimes we get into this, well, people shouldn't need to get a trophy just for showing up and doing their job. Well, if you really want people to feel engaged and motivated, you have to see them, you have to hear them, and you have to show that you value them. And again, that means something different to each individual. So I love that idea, Chris, of just even in new hire orientation, get to know some basic things about people, what people like, their preferences, and then take the time to have the conversations and ask the questions and learn a little bit more. Like, how are they wired? What do they really care about? And back to that conversation earlier, that everyone is motivated by something. Find out what is it that really motivates them. Maybe this is just a job to them, but what is it in their life? Like, why do they need this job? What are their actual ultimate goals? Or what are they really working for? Find out their why. And when we get to know people on that level, we can take what might start as somewhat transactional and make it really meaningful and deeply relational.
Yeah, and I think if you're someone who is tempted to go into that, like, we don't need to give someone a trophy just for showing up, which sometimes I think that, like, that's normal. It does feel weird and unfair sometimes. But I'll go back to what you said at the beginning. I think you might have used different words, but you can be right about that, or you can be effective. And if you want to die on that hill, great. And you have the opportunity for your team to be more effective and for you to be more effective as a leader. And it might involve giving out some things for people just doing their job.
Yeah. And I want to name two things here, and I'll count this as my final thoughts. One, people say, well, is my compensation, is my salary a form of recognition? can be based on the culture of your organization. If it's compared to other people in the organization in the same position, my personal approach to compensation, and I think what the science reflects, is compensation you issue to get the idea of compensation off the table. Pay people enough so they're not worried about the compensation. And then you focus on the work and you reward performance in the work. And you do meaningful work together and you push a brand forward. And the natural outcrop of growing this organization, positioning our brand better, elevating our values, if we do those things, the organization, if it's a for-profit business, will do better and should allow for growth in compensation. But it's a very slippery slope to try to use compensation as recognition and say, well, they're paid every 2 weeks. Well, if that's your take, the second I can make another few bucks from someone else that's going to pay me to do the same work, that's maybe closer to my house, or doesn't sweat me coming in, punching the clock at 9 a.m. every day, I'll just go do the same thing over there. How about that? So again, a leader can take that approach, but it does have an expense. And I want to just kind of wrap up, like, what is the bigger picture here? Corrective action, performance development, and recognition are tools that really effective leaders have to master these domains, because they are what you use to steward and advance the well-being of other people. I always say, we raised our hands. We said we wanted to be a leader. We raised our hands to steward the well-being of others. And if you don't have command of all three of these domains, it's very difficult to produce that outcome.
Final thoughts for me. We need to not shy away that now as a leader, we are responsible to define what good looks like and move people closer and closer to what good looks like regarding their work. And a lot of times regarding what good looks like outside of work. Because guess what? Like, people aren't different people when they're on the clock and when they're off the clock. So for leaders who hesitate to say, I'm in the business of behavior change, I think it's harder to accept some of these conversations around performance development, coaching, recognition, and corrective action. So just embrace it. And it's scary. And yeah, the buck kind of stops with you as that leader to say, I'm going to make this person a better person. And I have some tools to do that. How do I do that? Like, hard and scary. And also just start little, right? There's lots of positive things that can happen. And a lot of that has to do with recognition.
Yeah, final thoughts for me is that it's not about how far someone goes, but how far they've traveled to get to where they are. So that means if our job as leaders is to pay positive attention to what people do well, even the small things, that means we also have to recognize what's the starting point. And for some, that literally means actually getting to work on time and showing up is a big deal. And when we recognize that they do that, we help them see more of that. For others, they may have started as a star performer. How far are they willing to travel? And how do we recognize meaningful contribution at whatever incremental level that someone is starting from?
You bet. Well, I've really enjoyed the conversation today. I appreciate you guys, and I'd be remiss to not call out, like, we're here at Nahara this week for the National Native American Human Resources Association conference for this year. It's completely sold out. We're here in beautiful Durant, Oklahoma at Choctaw Casino Resort. We thank them for the use of this space and our studio for this episode, and look forward to a great week. Thank you guys for the feedback here. And Hannah, you want to read us out?
You bet. Magic in the Room is hosted by Chris Province, Hannah Broderud, and Luke Freeman. It is produced by Ben West. Social media management is by Emma Holland and Maggie King Robinson. Our theme music is by Evan Grimm. You can find his music on Apple Music. This episode was recorded on site during the annual Nahara Conference in Durant, Oklahoma. Magic in the Room is a production of Purpose and Performance Group. Find us at purposeandperformancegroup.com. You can find previous episodes at magicintheroom.com.